Snow fell that night like silence made visible, thick and endless, turning the Wyoming plains into a shroud of white. The wind carried no mercy, only the voice of the dead winter calling through the pines. Inside a cabin crouched against the storm, Elijah Jackson sat by a dying fire, his shadow long against the wall. A small white kitten lay curled in his rough hands, ribs showing through its fur. He whispered nothing, for there was nothing left to say. The world had taken enough. His wife, his newborn, and the music from his heart. Only the kitten still breathed, a weak, shivering reminder that life sometimes refuses to stop. The door shook once. Then again, soft, almost mistaken for the sound of wind against wood. Elijah looked up, the lantern flame trembling with him. No one traveled these parts after sundown, not in weather like this. The clock ticked slow on the mantel, marking out his disbelief. When the third knock came, faint as a dying man's cough, he rose, setting the kitten inside the pocket of his coat. His boots creaked against the boards. The wind moaned through the cracks as he drew the latch. A shape stood in the blizzard's throat, a woman, her hair frozen in black strands against her cheeks, her coat soaked through to the bone. The snow clung to her lashes like salt. She did not speak at first, only bowed her head slightly as if apologizing for surviving. When she lifted her eyes, they were dark and still, like the deep water of a well. "The work," she said, voice trembling through broken English. "Cook, clean. Just roof for night." Elijah stared, torn between instinct and pity. She looked young, perhaps 27, maybe less, the kind of age grief makes uncertain. He saw the thinness of her wrists, the cracked skin of her hands, the way she tried to stand proud despite shaking knees. Behind her, snow swept through the lantern's glow like 1,000 ghosts. "There's nothing here worth working for," he muttered. Her lips curved in the faintest smile of surrender. "Then I work for nothing." For a long breath he said nothing. The cold crept in, biting at his face, biting at her silence. Then the kitten mewed, a fragile sound from his pocket. The woman's eyes softened. She bent slightly, the way one might before a prayer. "Little one hungry," she whispered. And just like that, something old in Elijah cracked, the kind of breaking that feels almost like remembering. He stepped aside. "Come in before you die on my porch." She entered carefully, as though afraid her footprints might offend the floor. The heat of the fire kissed her cheeks red. She unwrapped her shawl, revealing a face both foreign and humanly familiar. Exhaustion, hunger, courage. Elijah shut the door, bolting it against the howl. The cabin smelled of smoke and loneliness. A single photo stood on the mantel, a young woman holding a child, both caught in that eternal stillness of the dead. The stranger's eyes paused there, then quickly looked away. Elijah set the kitten down by the hearth. It staggered to the ashes, sniffing at the warmth. The woman knelt beside it, her movements graceful despite her fatigue. From her satchel she pulled a small bundle, a crust of bread wrapped in cloth, and crumbled a piece for the kitten. "You feed him?" Elijah asked, half bewildered. "He's smaller than hunger," she said softly. "He win if someone help." He leaned against the wall, watching her. The firelight painted her face in gold and shadow, revealing scars not of violence but of labor, years of surviving where she was not meant to. She spoke little, but her presence filled the small room with something rare, purpose. He brought her a dry blanket. She thanked him with a nod, wrapping it tight. When he asked her name, she spoke it like a breath, "Mei Lin." The sound lingered in the air longer than expected, like a note from a far instrument. They ate in silence. She took half of his meager stew, though she seemed to taste more warmth than food. Outside, the storm thickened, pressing against the windows like a living thing. Inside, the logs hissed, each spark briefly illuminating the photo on the mantel. At one point, Mei Lin rose, moving to hang her wet coat near the fire. Her body trembled, but she refused to sit idle. She began sweeping the corners with a broken broom she'd found by the door. Elijah almost protested, but her eyes, so calm, so determined, stopped him. "You don't owe me work," he murmured. She smiled faintly. "Work make me warm." He turned away, uneasy at the ache that stirred behind his ribs. He had not shared space with another soul since the burial. He'd forgotten the small sounds of a living house, the rustle of fabric, the sigh of effort, the breath between words. He didn't know whether to feel grateful or afraid. Later, when the storm groaned like a creature dying, Elijah added more wood to the fire. Mei Lin sat near the hearth, her fingers spread toward the flames. The kitten crawled into her lap and began to purr, a weak, uncertain sound that deepened as she stroked its fur. "You lost someone," she said suddenly, not as question but as truth. Elijah froze, the words cutting through him with the accuracy of the uninvited. "Everyone loses someone," he replied. She looked at the photograph, then back at him. "Not everyone keep the door open." He didn't answer. Her voice had the softness of snow falling on graves, gentle, but it left a mark. The hours passed in the hush that follows shared suffering. Elijah dozed in his chair, the storm's voice dimming outside. Mei Lin rose quietly and placed another log on the fire, careful not to wake him. She looked around the cabin, at the tools, the empty cradle by the wall, the man who had forgotten how to live, and whispered something in Chinese, a small prayer that sounded like gratitude. When she finally sat down again, the kitten curled closer to her chest, its purring steady now. She closed her eyes. The firelight wove gold into her hair, and for the first time since she'd knocked, she looked warm. Elijah stirred awake just as the wind broke into a howl, rattling the shutters. He glanced toward the window, half expecting the storm to reclaim what it had lost. But the woman was still there, the kitten still alive, and his house, for the first time in years, no longer felt empty. He looked at her, sleeping in the glow, and felt the strange weight of something returning, something he didn't dare name. Outside, dawn began to edge faintly into the storm, a pale bruise of light in the east. He whispered to himself, not sure why, not sure to whom, maybe she'll leave when it clears. But as he spoke, the kitten mewed again, small and certain, as if the night itself disagreed. Morning broke soft as breath upon glass, the kind of light that feels too gentle for the world it touches. The storm had passed, but its silence lingered, heavy as prayer. Elijah Jackson stood at his door, looking over the plains glazed with frost. Smoke from the chimney rose straight into the pale sky, and for the first time in years, the air inside his cabin smelled not only of ash but of bread. Mei Lin was already awake. She moved through the small room like a quiet current, sweeping, mending, warming the fire without asking where anything belonged. Her sleeves were rolled past her wrists. Her hair was tied in a loose knot that kept falling forward as she worked. When she noticed him watching, she paused and offered a small nod, neither shy nor bold, simply an acknowledgement that the day had begun. Elijah's voice was rough from disuse. "You sleep any?" She nodded once. "Warm floor," she said softly, then turned back to the stove. He wanted to tell her she could use the bed, that he could take the chair. But the words caught on pride and something unnameable. Instead, he watched her ladle out the porridge, careful as though feeding something sacred. The kitten meowed, small and insistent, and she smiled, the first smile he'd seen that wasn't carved from endurance. When she placed a bowl before him, she did not sit. She waited, hands folded in her lap, until he took the first spoonful. Then she ate. Their silence was not awkward. It was thick with unspoken stories, like the air before spring thunder. Outside, the land glittered with frozen light. Elijah went to split wood while she hung damp clothes to dry. Through the window he saw her feeding the kitten with a dropper, whispering in her native tongue. The sound wasn't words to him, only music, soft, lonesome, kind. By midday the sheriff rode by. Amos Kettering was a large man with the kind of voice that thought itself right. He tipped his hat at Elijah but not at her. "You got company," he said, looking pointedly at the woman inside. Elijah's jaw set. She needed shelter. "Shelter's one thing," the sheriff replied, spitting into the snow. "But you keep her, folks'll talk. Ain't no work for her kind here anyway." The door creaked as Elijah shut it behind him. Inside, Mei Lin pretended not to hear, but her fingers trembled as she folded a quilt. The kitten, sensing the tremor, pressed itself against her arm. When he returned she said only, "I clean barn?" He looked at her hands, small, cracked, bleeding at the edges, and shook his head. "Rest first." Her gaze met his, steady as a mountain stream. "Work make me warm." And so she went, the broom nearly taller than her. He followed a moment later, guilt heavy in his throat. She was kneeling by the stall, brushing straw, humming again. It was the same melody from the night before, low, ancient, carrying something that made even the animals calm. The kitten trailed her everywhere, leaving tiny prints in the dust. Elijah found himself listening to her song long after she'd finished it. As evening deepened, the wind rose again, not a storm, just a restless whisper through the pines. He fixed the lanterns while she mended one of his shirts, her needle catching the last of the light. When he asked where she'd learned to sew, she only said, "Mama teach before train." Then her voice faltered and he did not ask more. In the quiet that followed, he felt the pulse of something unfamiliar, an ache that wasn't quite pain. Perhaps it was memory waking. Later, as he cleaned his rifle, she knelt by the hearth. Her head was bowed, hands pressed together. The kitten sat beside her as though keeping vigil. He realized she was praying, not to his God, maybe not to any God he knew, but the sincerity of it filled the room. He sat beside her when she finished. "What did you say?" She hesitated, then answered in halting English. "I say thank you for life still here." The words struck him harder than she could know. Life still here? What an impossible phrase. He'd buried all the proof of it years ago. Yet in that moment, watching the kitten yawn and her eyes glint in the firelight, he wondered if she might be right. That night, he dreamed for the first time in a long while, not of graves, but of a river thawing under spring sun. He woke to the sound of her footsteps, soft and certain. She was tending the fire again, murmuring to the kitten. When she noticed he was awake, she poured him coffee without asking. He wanted to tell her he wasn't used to kindness. Instead he said, "You don't need to do all that." She smiled faintly. "Then you forget what house feel like." He didn't answer. There was no arguing with truth spoken that gently. Days passed, measured not by talk but by shared motion. The scrape of a chair, the hiss of boiling stew, the rustle of her hair in the wind. Slowly the cabin began to change. She patched curtains, scrubbed the floor, and folded the quilt his wife once made. He caught himself watching her hands, small but sure, the same way he used to watch the sky for weather. Once, as she hummed and swept, he realized the melody had changed. It was no longer mournful, it carried warmth, almost playfulness. The kitten leaped at the broom bristles and she laughed, startling herself. He turned, pretending not to notice the way her laughter thinned the air of sorrow. When evening came, they shared a stew thicker than before. He spoke of the land, of cattle, of winters harsher than this one. She listened as though every word were a fire she might keep. And when he asked about China, she said softly, "Too far. Like dream I forget." Something in him stirred, recognition, maybe pity, maybe something else. He reached for his cup and found her gaze waiting. It wasn't love yet, but it was the beginning of being seen. Outside, the sky bruised into indigo. The wind carried the sound of coyotes calling across the frozen valley. Elijah added wood to the fire. Mei Lin drew the blanket closer around her shoulders, her face lit by gold flicker. The kitten stretched in her lap, purring in rhythm with the flame. He thought of the sheriff's words, of the neighbors who'd whisper by morning. Keeping her here would mean trouble. But watching her now, fragile yet stubborn, he knew trouble had already arrived, and he no longer feared it. As the fire settled into embers, she spoke again, barely above a whisper. "In my language, quiet house means safe heart." He looked at her, then really looked, the strength under softness, the life beneath loss. The kitten stirred between them, its fur glowing pale as snow. For a long time neither moved. The fire sighed, the walls held their breath. Outside, snow began to fall again, slow, tender flakes drifting against the window like a promise trying to be heard. And though neither spoke it aloud, both knew the same truth. The storm had not truly ended, it had only come inside to be shared. The first thaw came early that year, but it carried no warmth. The snow receded into silver puddles, leaving behind the sound of dripping roofs and restless gossip. The valley always woke with the same voice when winter broke, a chorus of whispers traveling faster than the river. Elijah Jackson rode into town one gray morning, his hat pulled low and his mind still heavy with the quiet of home. He needed flour, nails, and lamp oil. He did not expect the stares. Inside the general store, two men leaned by the counter, speaking in voices meant to be overheard. "Jackson's got himself a China woman up there," one said, spitting tobacco into a bucket. "Hired her, they say. Keeps her hidden like a ghost." The other laughed. "More than hired, I reckon. Ain't no work that lasts through the night." Elijah's hand froze on the bag of nails. A heat that had nothing to do with shame burned up his neck. He turned, his voice low. "Say that again." They looked at him, smirking, knowing they'd struck something raw. The storekeeper, an old man named Barrett, cleared his throat. "Now, Elijah, no need for trouble." But trouble was already there, small and sharp as splinters under skin. Elijah set his coins on the counter, took what he needed, and left without a word. Outside, the wind bit at his face. He could still hear their laughter echoing behind the door. The ride home felt longer than usual. Clouds pressed low over the hills and the thawed mud clung to his boots. When he reached the cabin, Mei Lin was outside, hanging wet linens on a line. The kitten perched on a fence post, blinking at the light. She looked up and smiled, unaware of the poison the world had started to breathe. He dismounted, his face unreadable. "You should stay inside more," he muttered. Her smile faltered. "I do wrong?" "No," he said quickly, too quickly. "Just, people talk." She tilted her head, not understanding. Her English had grown better, but some wounds are carried in tone, not words. Talk about what? Elijah couldn't answer. He walked past her into the house, setting the sack on the table with more force than needed. The kitten followed her inside, tail flicking. She stood near the door, silent, waiting for something he couldn't name. Finally he said, "You came here for work. You've done plenty. Maybe it's time you moved on." The words came out colder than he meant. She didn't flinch. Only nodded once, slowly, as if she had already rehearsed this moment. "If I go," she said softly, "the kitten die." He looked up. Her eyes were steady, not pleading. Just true. She turned back to her chores, humming again, the same low melody she used when she wanted to fill silence without asking forgiveness. Elijah sat by the fire, watching her move through the cabin like someone determined not to break. That night he couldn't sleep. The wind scratched the shutters and the kitten's tiny breaths filled the dark. He thought of the faces in town, the sneers, the way pity and malice often wore the same mask. He told himself she was safe or gone, but the thought of her walking alone through the snow made him grip the blanket until his knuckles went white. By morning she was gone from the house. Panic hit him like a fist. He went outside and found her near the barn, kneeling beside a pile of broken boards, trying to patch the fence with rope. "What are you doing?" he snapped, half anger, half fear. She looked up calmly. "You said I work until I go. I finish all before leaving." He stood there, chest tight, watching her fingers, small, raw, bleeding from the cold. The kitten meowed from the window, its voice sharp with hunger. Elijah exhaled hard and dropped to his knees beside her. "You're not leaving today." She said nothing. Only passed him a length of rope and tied the next knot. They worked in silence. By noon the fence was fixed, the wind had gentled, and both of them were shaking from exhaustion. Inside, she poured him tea made from wild herbs. He took it, still unable to meet her eyes. "Why you care what they say?" she asked finally. "Because I know this town," he said. "They'll make it hard for you." "Hard for me." She stared into the cup. "Always hard for me," she whispered. "Not new." He looked at her then, the scar at her temple, the lines of hunger carved around her mouth, the strange, fierce calm in her eyes. Shame washed through him like thaw water through dust. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "It's not you I'm angry at. It's the world." She nodded once, the kind of nod that carries forgiveness long before it's asked. In the days that followed, something between them changed. The air was still heavy with silence, but now it was shared. He began teaching her words from his books, simple things at first. "Bread, tree, sky." She repeated them carefully, her accent soft as breath. When she mispronounced bucket, they both laughed for the first time, and it felt like light through cracked wood. The kitten grew stronger, bounding across the floor after her needle as she sewed. Elijah started leaving his coffee mug for her to fill, a quiet ritual that said more than speech. But outside their fragile peace, the world continued to twist. Martha Yule stopped by one morning, her bonnet tied tight under her chin like armor. She looked around the cabin with narrowed eyes. "Didn't expect to find company here," she said, her voice thick with judgment. Elijah stood behind Mei Lin, his tone flat. "She works here. That's all." Martha sniffed. "Working women don't usually wear a man's wife's apron." Before Elijah could answer, Mei Lin stepped forward, her voice gentle but unyielding. "I clean for him. Cook for him. Nothing else." Martha's mouth pinched into silence. She left without another word, but her look said enough. After she was gone, Mei Lin sat down, her hands trembling slightly. "She think bad things," she said. Elijah sighed. "She thinks what she wants. You can't change that." Mei Lin looked up at him. "Then I stay until you tell me go." "Not them." Something in her tone, quiet steel beneath humility, stopped him cold. He nodded, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he smiled. It was small, but it stayed. That night, the wind returned. The storm howled through the pines again, echoing the town's voice, cruel and cold. Inside they sat by the fire. The kitten purred between them. Elijah reached for her hand without thinking, rough fingers brushing soft ones. She did not pull away. She spoke then, barely louder than the fire's crackle. "Snow still fall," she said. "But I am not cold now." He looked at her, seeing not fragility but flame, steady, defiant, alive. And in that moment he knew the whispers would only grow louder, and he no longer cared. Outside, a gust slammed against the door, scattering ash from the hearth. The lantern flickered, and for an instant, the light revealed something that looked almost like peace. But beneath it, both of them felt the same tremor, the sense that the world was stirring again, preparing to test whatever warmth they had built. He whispered to himself, half vow, half warning, let them talk. Yet in the quiet that followed, the kitten froze, ears twitching toward the window. From somewhere beyond the wind, faint footsteps crunched in the snow. The snow returned not as mercy but as a verdict. Clouds rolled low over the valley, their bellies swollen with judgment, and by dusk the world had gone white again. The wind moaned like a wounded creature, sweeping through the broken fences and over the cabin roof that trembled with each gust. Inside the air was warm, but tension hung heavier than the smoke that coiled above the fire. Elijah Jackson sat sharpening his axe by the hearth, each stroke of metal on stone slow and deliberate. Mei Lin was mending a blanket, her needle flashing faintly in the lamplight. The kitten slept between them, its small body rising and falling in a rhythm too pure for the noise of the world. He could feel her eyes on him between stitches, curious, cautious, perhaps worried. He hadn't spoken much since morning, since the sheriff's visit. The memory of Amos Kettering at the door was still fresh, the smell of wet leather, the frost in his beard, the words that hung like frostbite. "Town's uneasy," the sheriff had said. "Some folks think you're forgettin' what's proper. That woman's a burden you don't need. Send her along before it gets ugly." Elijah had stood silent then, jaw locked, eyes on the snow behind the man's shoulder. He hadn't trusted his voice not to betray the anger pulsing beneath his ribs. When the sheriff finally rode off, leaving hoofprints that vanished in minutes, the silence he left behind felt colder than the storm itself. Now, as the wind pressed against the walls, Mei Lin spoke quietly. "He say bad things?" Elijah didn't look up. "He said things people say when they're afraid." She threaded another stitch. "Afraid of what?" "Of anything they don't understand." Her fingers paused. "Then they afraid of me." He lifted his gaze finally. Her eyes met his, dark and still as winter water. "Maybe," he said. "But they'll have to face me first." The words surprised him. They sounded like a promise. Night deepened. The storm grew angrier. Snow slammed the shutters. Wind crawled through the seams in the walls. The lantern flickered as though struggling to stay alive. Elijah rose to check the barn, habit born of survival. "Stay inside," he told her. "Lock the door behind me." She nodded, though her eyes followed him to the threshold. "Wind too strong," she warned. He stepped out into the howl anyway, boots vanishing beneath the drifts. The world outside was chaos, a white blindness, snow cutting at his face, breath freezing in his beard. He fought his way to the barn, the faint glow of his lantern a trembling dot in the dark. Inside, the horses shifted nervously. The roof groaned, heavy under the snow's weight. He shoveled what he could, praying it would hold till morning. A crash split the air like gunfire. He turned. The far side of the roof had caved in, spilling snow and splinters over the stalls. One horse screamed. Elijah lunged forward, grabbing the reins, dragging the animal free. Pain shot up his shoulder as he slipped, falling hard against the frozen ground. The lantern shattered beside him, flame hissing out in the snow. Back at the cabin, Mei Lin had been pacing by the door, the kitten pressed to her chest. When the crash came, she flinched, and then moved without thinking. She grabbed Elijah's spare coat from the hook, threw it over her shoulders, and stepped into the storm. The wind struck her like a blow, tearing at her shawl, stinging her eyes with ice. But she pushed forward, following the faint outline of the barn through the white blur. "Elijah," she called, the name barely a breath against the roar. He heard her before he saw her, a voice fragile yet fierce, carried by the wind like a song refusing to die. He turned, half blinded, half in disbelief, and saw her figure emerging from the storm, small but unyielding. "What in God's?" he began, but she was already beside him, trying to help him lift the beam that pinned the last horse. Together they heaved, muscles trembling. The horse bolted free, disappearing into the snow. Mei Lin stumbled, the coat slipping from her shoulders, and Elijah caught her before she fell. "You shouldn't have come," he shouted over the wind. Her face was pale, lips blue. "You say we share house. Then we share storm." He stared at her, unable to answer because something in her eyes, a light that refused to break, was stronger than anything the world had left him. They staggered back to the cabin, soaked and shaking. The fire had nearly died. Elijah dropped to his knees, feeding wood into the hearth with trembling hands. Mei Lin knelt beside him, shivering uncontrollably. The kitten mewed from its blanket, frightened by the cold. Without thinking, Elijah took her hands, small, icy, trembling like trapped birds, and pressed them between his own. "You'll freeze," he muttered. She tried to smile. "I not freeze easy." He shook his head, eyes on her frostbitten fingers. "You're bleeding." She looked at him, her expression softening into something he hadn't seen before. Not gratitude, not fear, but understanding. "You care too much for things already gone," she whispered. "Let some stay." The words struck deep. He thought of the photograph on the mantel, the graves on the hill, the years spent keeping his heart half buried with them. He met her gaze, and for the first time since he'd lost his family, he didn't look away. The storm howled outside, but inside the cabin the world grew still. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, then sat beside her as the fire climbed back into life. The kitten crawled into her lap, purring weakly. "Why'd you really stay here?" he asked finally. She looked into the flames. "Because when you opened door that night, I see man not dead yet. I think, maybe I not dead either." He swallowed hard. "That's not what I meant." "I know," she said softly. "But it's true anyway." A long silence stretched between them, the kind that feels like a beginning. Outside, the blizzard screamed, relentless, beating at the windows like a mob of ghosts. He could almost hear the town's voice in the wind, those who had judged her, who would judge him next. But the world beyond the walls felt smaller now. The cabin, their tiny island of warmth, felt like the only true place left. As midnight neared, the storm reached its peak. The roof creaked, snow piling thick against the door. Elijah rose, checking the latch. "If it holds till dawn, we'll be all right." Mei Lin sat watching him, her face bathed in amber glow. "You always wait for dawn?" He turned, startled by the question. "What do you mean?" She smiled faintly. "Some people live whole life waiting for morning. But night has fire too." He didn't know what to say. Her words lingered in the air, tender as confession. He moved closer, sitting opposite her by the fire. The kitten stirred between them, pressing against both their hands. When he reached out to steady it, his fingers brushed hers. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The wind outside wailed, the fire cracked. Their eyes met, and the distance that had kept them safe finally melted. "I'll keep you safe," he said quietly. She shook her head. "We safe already. You just don't see." He almost laughed at that, how her broken English could sound like scripture. Outside, dawn began to bloom faintly beyond the storm, a thin line of gray beneath the clouds. The worst had passed, they'd survived another night. But the world beyond their walls had not forgiven them. He knew the town would come soon enough, their righteousness sharper than ice. Still, as he looked at her, wrapped in his blanket, the kitten asleep between them, he felt something shift deep within him. Not peace yet, but courage, the kind that comes from choosing what the world forbids. He rose, went to the window, and watched the pale light break through the snow. "It's easing," he said softly. Behind him, her voice came, barely above a whisper. "Then we start again." He turned back, saw her smile, tired, alive, unafraid, and realized she meant it. The fire hissed as snow melted from his coat. The wind moaned one last time and fell silent. For a moment, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Then, faintly from somewhere down the valley, came the echo of distant hoofbeats. When the thaw finally came, it crept in quietly, as if ashamed of all the damage winter had done. Snowmelt trickled from the eaves and ran in thin ribbons down the hill, carrying bits of straw and broken twigs into the river below. The air no longer stung, it smelled of damp earth and beginnings. Elijah Jackson stood by the barn with his hands deep in his coat pockets, watching the light return to the land like a man trying to remember how to see. Behind him, the door opened. Mei Lin stepped out, her shawl drawn close around her shoulders. The white kitten trailed her like a shadow, weaving between her feet before springing onto the fence post. She had grown stronger since the storm. Her face had color again, her eyes bright and calm. When she looked at him, he felt the kind of stillness that only comes after surviving something meant to end you. "The river moves again," she said softly, pointing toward the thawing banks. He nodded. "It'll flood soon if we're not careful." "You build wall?" "I'll build what I can," he said, but his voice lacked its old certainty. He wasn't thinking about the river. He was thinking about what would come from the town once the roads cleared. The sheriff's words still echoed in his mind. The storm had kept them safe for a while, but it wouldn't keep them hidden forever. People remembered what they judged, and judgment never melted with the snow. That night, he fixed the latch on the barn door while Mei Lin cooked inside. The scent of stew reached him through the open window, simple food, but it filled the air with peace. He paused, leaning on his hammer, and listened to her humming again. It was no longer a song of endurance but of belonging. When he went inside, the table was set with 2 bowls. The kitten licked its paw beside a saucer of milk. Mei Lin poured tea and glanced at him shyly. "You work all day. Eat." He sat down, taking the spoon from her hand. Their fingers brushed, just enough to silence the world for a heartbeat. The firelight gilded her hair, catching every thread of warmth it could. "I don't deserve this," he murmured. She looked at him in confusion. "Deserve what?" "Peace." "Any of it." "You not take," she said simply. "You share." He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "You make it sound easy." Her eyes softened. "Hard things make strong hearts." They ate in silence after that, and he realized it wasn't silence at all. It was comfort, something long forgotten and newly found. A few days later, the first riders came. 3 men from town, their coats dusted with road salt and their expressions set like stone. Elijah saw them before they reached the gate. He didn't move to meet them. Mei Lin was outside hanging laundry, her back turned to the road. The kitten mewed at the sight of strangers. The lead rider dismounted, a man Elijah recognized as Caleb Morris, a farmer whose bitterness grew wherever envy could take root. "Jackson," Caleb called. "We come peaceable, but this ain't right what you're doing. Town says you're harboring her." Elijah's jaw tightened. "She's under my roof, not my chain." Caleb spat into the mud. "Doesn't matter. She don't belong here. She'll bring trouble. She's done more good here than most of you ever will." Caleb's gaze flicked toward Mei Lin, who had turned now, her laundry forgotten in her hands. "Then let her prove it somewhere else." Elijah stepped forward. The air between them trembled, full of things neither wanted to say. "You'll ride home now," he said quietly. "There's nothing for you here." One of the other men muttered, "You'd fight your own kind for her?" Elijah's eyes darkened. "For decency," he said. "For what's left of it." The men looked at one another, unsure. The storm had taken much of their confidence. After a long silence, Caleb turned his horse and rode off, the others following reluctantly. Snowmelt splashed under their hooves, the sound fading down the valley. When they were gone, Elijah turned back toward the cabin. Mei Lin stood there, the wind tugging at her shawl. "You should go inside," he said softly. Her voice trembled. "They come again." He nodded. "Maybe. But next time they'll know I'm waiting." That night the tension broke. The world outside dripped inside, and inside, the fire cast golden halos on the walls. Mei Lin sat at the table writing, her brow furrowed. When he passed behind her, he saw the words in shaky English. "This home warm." He stopped, unable to breathe for a moment. "You wrote that?" She smiled faintly. "You teach me letters. I learned for this." He touched the paper as if afraid it would vanish. "It's true," he whispered. Later, when the stormlight faded into spring dawn, Elijah saddled his horse and rode to town. The air smelled of wet soil and distant rain. He tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and walked in. Amos Kettering looked up, surprised. "She's staying," Elijah said before the man could speak. "You can tell whoever needs to know. She's my wife now." The sheriff blinked. "Your wife?" Elijah's gaze held steady. "In every way that matters." The sheriff sighed, rubbing his temples. "You sure about this, Jackson? Folks won't take kindly. Then they can take it however they please." He left before the man could answer, the sound of the door closing like a final decision. When he returned to the cabin, the river was roaring, wild from the melt. Mei Lin was kneeling in the mud, rescuing a line of fallen laundry. The kitten perched on a stump, tail twitching. She looked up as he dismounted, eyes questioning. He walked to her, took her muddy hands in his and said simply, "It's done." Her brow furrowed. "What done?" "I told them. You're my wife." For a long time she said nothing. Then her hands trembled in his grasp, not from fear but from something deeper. "You want this?" she whispered. "I don't know what I want anymore," he said. "But I know what I need. This life. The quiet." Tears welled in her eyes and she nodded, barely managing the words. "Then I stay." He drew her close, forehead to forehead, the kitten mewing softly at their feet. Around them, the snow melted into running water, 1,000 tiny rivers carrying the memory of winter away. By sunset, they stood by the riverbank, their hands joined over the soil that would soon bloom. The air smelled of mud and pine and new hope. Elijah slipped a thin gold band from his pocket, the one that had belonged to his late wife. For years it had been a wound he couldn't touch. Now it felt like forgiveness. He placed it in Mei Lin's palm. "It's yours now." She looked at it, then at him. "You sure?" He smiled softly. "No. But that's how I know it's real." She closed her fingers around the ring, and the world seemed to quiet, as if listening. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled, spring's first warning or maybe its promise. The kitten brushed against their boots. She knelt to lift it, cradling it between them. Together they turned toward the cabin, their home small but full of light. And as they crossed the threshold, the last of the ice broke free from the eaves, falling into the earth with a sound like applause.